Welcome, everyone. With a great joy, we begin our closing conference of this period of activities on ancient Mediterranean archaeology at the University of São Paulo. This opportunity has indeed strained ties and further highlight classical archaeology at our university. We couldn't have a better lecture to finish these activities today. Welcome Professor Elizabeth Green. Professor Elizabeth Green holds a PhD in classics from the prestigious Princeton University. She's a faculty member in the Department of Classical Studies and Archaeology at the Brook University in Canada. Professor Green is also the current president of the Archaeological Institute of America, the leading American archaeological organization, highlighting her importance in the international academic scholarship. Moreover, Professor Green has built a career characterized by a profound commitment to research, teaching, and preservation of cultural heritage. She's one of the UNESCO's leading experts in maritime archaeology, with experience in excavations that become a benchmark in the field, such as the shipwreck of Pabuç, Burnu, which is the topic of this lecture today. Her work uniquely combined maritime archaeology with contemporary topics such as mobility, migration, exchange networks, and research ethics. Today, conference takes us into the archaic world through the remains of a shipwreck that, more than transporting goods, reveals economic interpretations and trade and circulation in the Mediterranean. It is titled Exchange in the Age of Lyric Poetry, the 6th century BCE Shipwreck at Pabuç, Burnu, Turkey. It's a great honor to have you here with us, Professor Liz. Welcome to USP, and we are immensely grateful for your inspirational closure to these circles of activities. Now I turn the floor to Professor Elizabeth Green.
Thank you so much, Marcio, for that kind introduction. And thank you to you and to Wagner and to Chris and to all of the faculty and mostly the students here who have listened to me and listened to Justin share the work that we have been doing underwater for the past few decades. It's been a pleasure to talk to all of you and a wonderful opportunity for us to have a chance to be here in Sao Paulo and to see more and to see Brazil. So thank you all for your hospitality. We really have been enjoying this opportunity so much. In what I want to talk to you about today, can I get slides? I want to share some of the research that has been ongoing for the past 20 years or so on the 6th century BCE shipwreck that sank off the coast of Turkey carrying a cargo of ceramic transport amphoras. The shipwreck gives us a really unique opportunity to think about some of the systems of exchange that flew largely under the radar. When we think about maritime trade in the ancient world, we think about big ships carrying big cargoes, and we see in the dedications in temples, the dedications that are preserved, the big scale architecture. We tend to think big, but this shipwreck gives us the chance to think small, and by thinking small, to get a glimpse into the people, the boats, the goods, the ideas that moved around the Mediterranean every day, not just on special occasions. And I think for all of us who work as archaeologists, whether we work underwater or on land, it's part of the unique nature of archaeology that it gives us the chance to see another part of the picture, those parts of the picture that the historical record, the glamorous objects, the gold, the silver, doesn't let us see. So this is my chance to speak a little about that. As I get started, though, I'd like to ask all of you to kind of look around, look at what you're wearing, what you're holding, what you're carrying, the furniture in the room, and think about what percentage of it was made here in Brazil, here in the Americas, here at all, and what percentage of it came here in a giant metal box, in one of these shipping containers that are about 12 meters long, 3 meters wide, and carry the vast majority of goods that have contributed to the globalization of our world today. These giant metal containers ushered in a form of movement and mobility in the contemporary age that's so different from what we saw even 100 years ago, where a boat that came in with a hodgepodge cargo of bags and boxes and crates and other things required armies of longshoremen to unload, to reload, and the like. The shipping container, though, allows everything to be packed in a box, put on a ship, put into a truck, and even transformed into a tiny house. It's often thought that the transport containers of antiquity, amphoras, served as a sort of shipping container that ushered in a mode of globalization in that re-emerged in the Mediterranean in the Archaic period, in the 8th century, 7th century, into the 6th century, and up through the world of classical Athens. So amphoras, these two-handled ceramic shipping containers, are normally thought to have carried a standard amount of goods, to be recognizable through their forms, through their fabric, as branded by the state that produced them, much like Ai Weiwei's sort of somewhat sarcastic, I think, branding of Chinese dynastic vase with Coca-Cola. We tend to think of the transport jars of antiquity of having that brand to them. They were sanctioned, they were certified, you knew what was in them, you knew how much was in them, and you could tell a consumer could tell all of these things just by looking. What we found, certainly in the Archaic period and certainly on this shipwreck, is that was not always the case. And so amphoras form a pathway into allowing us to think about the globalizing world of the Archaic period, of the period from the 8th through the beginning of the 5th century, where we see the world expanding, we see colonization, we see monumental architecture in the Greek world, the prominence of widely exported Corinthian ceramics and the beginning of Athenian black figure ceramics moving around the Mediterranean. We see the very beginnings of coinage and an economy that will eventually revolve around money, but in the Archaic period, this is not what we're seeing. Coins were probably not used, even fractional coinage were probably not used for everyday exchange. Instead, we need to think about the models that allowed for the everyday transactions of agricultural goods, processed agricultural goods between everyday people. And so an opportunity to study this type of movement between everyday people comes in a shipwreck that was found off the coast of Turkey, near about 35 kilometers from Halicarnassus, off the coast of Pabuç, Burnu, which translates as shoe point or curvy slipper point from the shape of the land off of which it was found. The wreck was pointed out to the Institute of Nautical Archaeology by local divers Salim Dincer and Ashkin Jambazolu, who were Ashkin, who was trained as an underwater archaeologist, developed a local diving agency in Bodrum, and by virtue of doing a lot of diving, came across amphoras that he hadn't seen before underwater and recognized as unique. These amphoras were, in fact, unique in the world of maritime archaeology because they reflected an Eastern Mediterranean shipwreck from the 6th century BCE, which had not been known before. The amphoras themselves, though, were not especially unique because they reflected local forms that were produced and circulated regionally in a fairly small area. So in 2001, George Bass went on a survey to look at the site where an amphora and an oinouthway or a wine pitcher were raised for sampling and analysis. And the Institute of Nautical Archaeology decided that this would be a great new project, a new site to explore. George Bass had a mandate that the Institute of Nautical Archaeology would excavate one shipwreck from every century of antiquity. This mandate is an exciting one, but not necessarily a research question. And when we went into the site, we thought through the research questions we could ask, largely about the sort of exchange that the site would represent. We wondered, knowing only that we had a fairly broad scatter of amphoras that you can see after excavation. When the site was first found, there were only about 8 jars visible on the surface, and many of which were broken. We thought about what we could find from this site, wondering what was under the sand. We wondered whether we would find Athenian black figure pottery circulating to Eastern markets. We wondered whether we would find evidence of a ship carrying colonists from the Greek mainland to the east. We wondered how this boat would fit in to narratives of the burgeoning globalization of the archaic world. We excavated the site between 2002 and 2003 at a depth of about 40 meters underwater. This meant that archaeologists were limited to about 2 dives per day, each lasting 20 minutes. For any of you who work on land, you recognize just how small an amount of time to work this is. We excavated the site over the course of 2 years, and as you'll see the objects that we found, you'll understand perhaps why I say research and conservation is ongoing on the ceramic cargo and the remains of the ship itself that were found. The primary category of objects that were found on this site were amphoras, about 250 of them in quite extremely broken forms. About under 30 of them were intact, the rest were broken and scattered over the seabed. From the intact amphoras, we sieved their contents, and we found primarily grapes, a series of grape seeds inside almost every one. We found the occasional olive seed and occasional bits and pieces of grape stems that probably reflected the unfiltered nature of early Greek wine that would have had lots of pits and lees in it, often evoking, I think, the ancient drinking game of tossing the lees of your cup at a target over during the symposium. Our thought from the jars, the olive pits, and the grape seeds is that their cargo was primarily wine with potentially some olive oil as well. The amphoras were scattered all over a fairly widespread site of about, each of these lines reflects 2 meters. The site was about 28 meters in length on the plan and about half that in width. For those of you used to seeing plans oriented north, this one is slightly wonky because when we work underwater, we tend to look upslope in order to orient ourselves without the benefit of land. While the amphoras were scattered pretty much all over this broad expanse of the site, in a fairly discrete area toward the upslope part, we found more common wares, daily use items, possibly shipboard items. And through this, we associated this upper part of the ship with the kitchen or the galley area, or the place where personal items were stored. The blue dots reflect common wares, small pitchers and jugs, mortaria or large shallow bowls used for mixing or grinding that might have been used for onboard dining or food preparation. We found these, though you're looking at pictures of 3, we found these largely in assemblages of 4, not side by side, but 4 of each object, suggesting to us maybe that this boat was crewed by 4 sailors. Toward the middle of the site, right in the dark orange dot, we found a large stone anchor stock. Anchor stocks would have held the wooden fluke and arms of the anchor and would have been the part of the anchor that kept it weighted on the seabed. But the majority of the cargo were amphoras, and these amphoras came from the region right around Halicarnassus. Some were almost certainly local. They reflect the ceramic fabrics of archaic Halicarnassus. Others seem closer in fabric to Knidos and to nearby Rhodes. The forms are fairly consistent for Southeast Aegean jars of this period. And so we designate our regions from the ceramic color and petrography rather than through these fairly similar styles of the echinoid body, the rounded handles, and this kind of outcurving rim, and the slightly flared toe. Here you can see the vast project of conservation of these thousands upon thousands of ceramic fragments that, based on minimum vessel counts from rims and from toes, we suspect is about 200 to 250 total jars. Mending them, though, has been a tremendous challenge. Following some years of desalinization, we also face the challenge of the fact that, though you might think if an amphora is in a ship and the ship sinks, and you excavate an area of 2 by 2 meters, the ceramics in that 2 by 2 meter square would be assembled into an amphora. But that is not what we found at all. Here you're looking at, and I remind you, each of these grid letters is a 2 by 2 meter square. The blue dots represent different pieces from this amphora that you're looking at over here. They were spread entirely over this 28-meter site and seem to have no rhyme or reason to where each piece was found, combined with the fact that in underwater context, if a piece of ceramic is next to an organic, its fabric might turn from medium brown to dark brown. And if it's exposed, it might become much lighter. So imagine putting together a puzzle that's all brown, different shades of brown, and the shades of brown that are close to each other in color don't actually match each other as you'd expect from doing a puzzle. It's been quite a challenge. Why have we cared to do this challenge? The reason is because shipwrecks give us the unique possibility of having a large assemblage of intact, hopefully one day intact jars. Here I show you some of the Southeast Aegean jars of the styles from Halicarnassus, Cnidos, and Rhodes. And you can see a lot of the common forms. These are 3 of our intact or mended examples, as well as some of the variations in form or fabric that's visible. We have a range in fabric color from kind of yellowish tan to more of a reddish brown, and ranges in rims from slightly smaller and flatter to more flared, some with bands underneath and some without. And one unique example looking like cone forms with this double-barreled handle. So within this generally similar style, we have a number of probably regional or possibly workshop variations. What kind of wine did they carry? Southeast Aegean wine was famed in antiquity, not necessarily for its great quality, but in the case of Halicarnassian wine, we know that these wines are saltwater wines. They're wines that are vinified with salt water, a tradition that continues in Italy today and was also produced in the Italian world during the period of in the Italian world in antiquity, as well as in the Southeast Aegean style. I see some faces. Saltwater wine sounds terrible. What they say today about saltwater wine is that it's kind of like putting salt in your brownies or salt on your caramel, that it brings out the sweetness of the wine. It's used in small quantities, not fully salty, and so it enhances the flavor of the wine. I can't say this for sure, but certainly we learn that the qualities of this saltwater wine is that they don't cause hangovers, they help with digestion in various ways, and they're extra good when mixed with hard water from springs. So clearly it had a quality that was desired and desirable. How did you know what you were buying? And what's the benefit of these assemblages that we have from shipwrecks? We were able to undertake capacity measurements of the intact and mended jars, less through some by filling with water and some by filling with polystyrene beads, tiny little beads that were light enough that that they wouldn't hurt a fragile object. We learned that filling with water was actually equivalent to filling with polystyrene beads, provided you had a consistent process that involved shaking the jars rather than stirring them with a stick, like James Bond's martinis, and that this system meant that we had virtually equivalent measurements, whether we used beads or water. In measuring the capacities, though, for jars that we expected, given their similarity in style and shape, we expected them to be fairly standardized. They were anything but. The blue line represents the average measurement of about 19 liters for these jars, but we see a range from about 16 liters all the way up to 23. And eyeballing the jars, it's actually quite difficult to say which is the biggest and which is the smallest. You can do that pretty well. If I put the biggest and smallest next to each other, you're good. But if I put two in the middle, it is almost impossible to tell the difference. I'm notoriously bad at figuring out what size container to put my leftovers in, so I didn't trust myself. But I would ask random passersby, tell me which one is bigger. And nobody could answer. They look quite similar. So we wondered if maybe instead of being constructed to a particular capacity, if these jars were simply meant to be fairly consistent in size. And that turned out to be closer to the case. The range of height and diameter was more consistent, if still variable, than the capacity of these jars. Many people have asked me, was it just they got a standard lump of clay? And in fact, that was one of our largest variables, that the weight of the different jars was in fact quite, had a pretty broad range. So consistency in standardization, in capacity standardization, doesn't seem to have been a key concern of our producers. In order to increase our sample size, the charts you were looking at were from the originally intact jars that we found. We've added to those numbers through mended jars, and we tried to see if we could do some digital reconstructions of capacity, either by spinning a drawing of a jar and just rotating it and calculating the capacity. This turned out to be highly inaccurate, probably because our jars are not particularly regular in terms of fabric thickness or in terms of regular all around. Some have dents, some have bumps. They're not the most carefully made jars. We also tried a system that Justin helped us to develop of 3D scanning producing a 3D model of the outside and the inside of the jar by dropping a camera in and modeling and then taking the volume of that interior volume. We're still working on the system, but again, it required intact jars, fairly intact jars that we could measure anyway, and was only somewhat accurate. I mention this because when we look at site reports and we hear about capacities of jars based on a fragment and a reconstructed jar, we have to take those capacities with a large amount of caution. We thought about, once we had these models, how these jars might have been stacked into a boat. And you can see from the top the stacking patterns of the jars from Pabuç Burnu that they didn't stack all that efficiently. And so probably the goal of our sailors, merchants, or whoever was on the boat was not necessarily to pack the greatest number of jars they could in order to sell standardized jars at market. What were they trying to do then? How do we imagine, in a largely pre-monetary economy, how do we imagine the exchange happening of these everyday, commonware, poorly standardized jars where no consumer could expect with any level of certainty that one jar had any form of connection to one city, one capacity, and presumably one commodity? we started looking to the text for some models. In this period, we're looking not only at the period of Greek colonization and Greek expansion, but also Lydian and Persian expansion. And the Greek city-states of Asia Minor are certainly paying tribute to the Lydian and Persian kings. If you are asked, as we hear from Herodotus to some degree, and from Akkadian and Old Persian texts, the king received his share of agricultural production that was collected by local vassals. If you're simply delivering to the king a gift or a tribute of a commodity, do you really need to be concerned with that one-to-one transaction of the individual jar? Probably not. This is one possibility. Another possibility is a bulk shipment for exchange, where the whole shipment is going to one place. We learn from a somewhat later, a early 5th century papyrus. Our shipwreck dates to the first half, probably the second quarter of the 6th century. So we're about 100 years later. We hear about the inspection in a customs account where an Ionian ship comes in and had 50 jars of oil in it, on which duty was collected. So at least in the case of duty in a paying customs or duties, you're paying not on a set capacity or a set total number of liters, but simply the number of jars. Do your jars need to be perfectly standardized? In that case, probably not. But what does that mean for at the level of the consumer? We hear from lyric poets about elite exchange. We hear about Sappho's husband who traded from Andros, Sappho's brother who imported lesbian wine to Naucratis, and a epitaph of a Cretan, Rotakos of Gorton, who was a trader. So we hear a little bit about trade by elite level Greeks, but we don't hear much about what they did, other than that they moved large amounts of commodities around, possibly in the same sorts of systems that we can imagine from that customs document. We hear in the Iliad about both elite and potentially somewhat less elite traders who fight during the Trojan War. From Homer, we hear about ships that are coming to Troy from Lemnos, from the island of Lemnos, sent by the king, King Jason. His son comes with a cargo of wine. Separately, to Menelaus and Agamemnon, to the kings, he gives wine as a gift. He gives them 1,000 measures of wine. Did they count it? I think not. To the other Greeks, some of them bought wine, probably in smaller transactions, some for bronze, some for iron, some for skins, some for oxen. Others paid slaves taken in war. And so we can imagine a more interactive form of exchange where at the moment of transaction, a relationship is forged, a relationship of perhaps quantity, of taste. Do you like what's being sold? And a decision about what it is that you will trade for what amount of commodity that you're going to receive. It's not the same commodity. It's not the same transaction. Relationships are forged at each stage of the process. It's highly inefficient, this form of trade, but establishes relationships between individuals. We hear about the non-elite exchange very rarely In Hesiod, we learn that if you're a farmer, you wait until the season where there is no farming. You wait until the sailing season has come, drag your ship to the shore, and put a cargo in so you can bring home profit, so that you can find a release, as Theognis tells us, from grievous poverty. Trade is also a way for farmers to exchange their commodities and gain a little more to help their day-to-day activities. But we hear very little about these farmers heading to market. I mentioned in the beginning that when we talked about our expectations for this shipwreck, and we wondered about Athenian black figure pottery coming to the east, we wondered about luxury goods of the sort that are found in the sanctuary of Hera, at the Horion on Samos, at the sanctuary of Artemis at Ephesus, all of the luxury goods that are dedicated. The most luxurious item we found on this wreck was a small Ionian cup. So from a little bit further north from the local area of this wreck, decorated with a black slip and some faint lines that you can see. This small cup was clearly so valuable to its owners in antiquity that it was mended, not just once, or not just in one place, but you can see mending hole here, matching one here, a mending hole here to here, another one here that would have matched another piece, and these would have been mended with lead staples to keep the cup together. So this was not a luxury cargo. This did not have luxury goods on board. Was it sailed by a family of 3 or 4 sailors, or were these pitchers, wine pitchers, and shallow bowls, were they used as measuring devices that might have been a means of establishing a framework for exchange? Instead of buying an amphora where you didn't know what was in it and you didn't know how much it had in it, would you have brought your own container? Would you have measured out or nahuai pitchers full of wine to take home? Would you have put them in your own container? Would you simply have measured out the commodity of wine in the jar? In this area of the site that's fairly blank, downslope, and up in here, we found quite a large number of loose organics. Olive pits and grape seeds and a few fig seeds. These are extremely difficult to collect underwater. They tend to float up as soon as you find them. And so we collected bags of sand when we found these and would sort them on the surface. But what we wondered is whether these bowls and pitchers might have been used themselves as measuring devices to heap or simply mound dry goods like olives or maybe baskets of grain of some kind, and to pour out pitchers of wine. It's impossible to tell, and their standardization is not that much better between the different jars than the amphoras themselves, but it provides a system for that possible mechanism of an alternate mechanism of measurement through which that relationship is established, through which you can see the dry goods, taste them, taste the wine, see if it is something that you want to purchase. We can imagine the system as something like the modern day market. And on the left, you're looking at the farmers market in St. Catharines, where I'm from, which I point out to say that you're looking at apples in the fall. There are no scales in the entirety of the St. Catharines farmers market. You buy a bag or a basket of apples, and the bag or the basket of apples has one price. Sometimes you might want big apples. Sometimes you might want small apples. You make that decision when you're there. And this is Mrs. Beamer. I buy apples in the fall every week from Mrs. Beamer. And if my apples one week are not good, I go the next week and I make a sad face to Mrs. Beamer and say the apples were all kind of mealy. And Mrs. Beamer says, "Oh, that shouldn't have happened. Here." And she hands me a bag of apples to make up for it. And so we have this relationship of the sort that I imagine took place also in antiquity, where regular markets, regular farmers, regular people established relationships over the sea versus the much more mechanized digital scales and prices where you might pay ridiculous unround numbers for some particular weight of commodities. This idea of local relationships, small scale trade, a relatively small vessel is supported by the remnants of the boat itself. Here you're looking at a few of the planks that were found of the ship in the very deepest part of the site, buried under more than a meter of sand, which led to their preservation in an anaerobic environment. And though they are preserved, they're quite degraded. The wood itself in total is probably only a little more than the surface of the desk in front of which I'm seated. But this wood gave us fascinating insight into the construction of ships in this period that were laced together with fibers through these triangular holes on their surface and on their edges. So you would lace a vegetal fiber through the holes to lash the planks together. We can see small wooden pegs that were placed in the holes in order to lock these ligatures into place after construction to keep the ropes from sliding around. And even on the planks that survive, we can see spaces for the frames, these rows of holes that would have supported the structure of the ship. And here, I think we mentioned to those of you who are in class, the damage by teredo worms and all of these white shell casings around the deteriorated parts of the hull are the external shells of these mollusks that bore their way into wood. In antiquity, we see evidence for the painting of hulls with various forms of paint and tar, and also the placing lead sheets over the hull to prevent damage from these teredo worms. Here you can see a replica model of a laced vessel from France that gives an idea of this sort of construction at Place Jules Verne off the coast of Marseille. And here you can see a replica sailing of this 10-meter vessel, probably about 3/4 of the size of the 15 or so meter boat that we imagined for the ship at Pabuç, Burnu. Back to our poets, we learn from Homer about Odysseus's construction of a boat to leave the island of Calypso after he's been stuck there for a while. She gives him an axe, he cuts down some trees, he planes their surfaces, and he pins them together with dowels and then lashes the boat together with cords. Scholars have sometimes thought about this as simply a raft, bunch of logs tied together, but if we think about the construction techniques that we see archaeologically, we might imagine that Odysseus, one man, admittedly, but a hero, was building a boat in the style that was actually in use in the archaic period. And the system of laced construction was probably one that was less labor intensive than other types of construction techniques that were known from the same time, and was better suited for these short distance voyages. Justin, who's here, created these models of sailing times from Bodrum or Halicarnassus, or basically from Pabuç, Burnu, over a day, 2 days, 3 days, and more. And we see that the 1 day of sailing, either thinking about the different winds going forward and backwards, or just in general, we can see this area of 1 day's sail from Pabuç, Burnu encountering pretty much the extent of our cargo. This boat is surely a vessel that's bringing goods to market, or perhaps bringing tribute goods to a collection point, where the latter of which I think is less likely than this basic goods to market model. This laced construction that I think supports our goods to market model is quite different from the mortise and tenon construction that we see already in the Bronze Age on the Uluburun shipwreck, this royal cargo that carried 10 tons of copper and tin, surely the shipment of a king, put together with individual mortises and cut into each plank, individual tenons that would have been pegged, requiring each piece to be carefully put together, requiring probably more labor than a laced vessel, but also probably making it more seaworthy for long journeys. This mortise and tenon construction becomes the norm once we hit the 5th century, with the construction of triremes and big multi-thousand jar amphora carriers designed to feed the Athenian Empire. But in the 6th century, even in this period of increasing globalization, and even beyond, the majority of the boats that surely sailed the Mediterranean were these small 15-ish meter boats who reflected the day-to-day activity of anybody who lived in the Mediterranean and wasn't necessarily affected directly by the need to feed the empire or bring luxury goods from point to point. This, rather than the Iron Age ships off Ashkelon that, again, like the shipwreck at Uluburun, carried big scale, or bigger scale at least, commodities, single commodities of nearly identical jars from the coast, the Levantine coast, probably to Egypt or Carthage. Industrial manufacture. We're not looking at that. At Pabuç, Burnu, we've got this hodgepodge of jars, similar in style, but reflecting different producers, different consumers. This is not a royal shipment of any kind. I suspect, though the two Iron Age wrecks at Ashkelon, they were only sampled on their surface. We have no idea about their hull remains. If we were to find them, I suspect they would also be mortise and tenon built. I can't swear to it, but I suspect long distance voyage, big cargo, king elite construction is very different from that day-to-day type of movement. In the last few minutes of this talk, I want to come back to this idea of the daily, everyday movement that connected the Mediterranean in antiquity and probably through to the present day. The movement of the people who are mostly invisible archaeologically, who are mostly invisible historically, whose movements we don't read about in the lyric poets, whose movements we don't read about in epic or from the historians. They're almost invisible to us, except through the archaeological record. This is how we can start asking questions about day-to-day exchange that didn't involve electrum or gold coinage of this period. This is how we think about everyday exchange that doesn't involve the dedication of gold philae and marble statues in sanctuaries, the movement that doesn't involve the marble required to construct sanctuary temples and sanctuaries to the gods. Instead, the everyday movement of goods that you might need, goods that you might simply like because they're better than what you're growing locally. And so through the questions we can ask about the mechanisms of exchange, the questions we can ask about the people involved in this form of exchange, the shipwreck at Pabuç lets us see these small 15, 14, 15, 16-meter boats that were a regular feature of local movement in a Mediterranean marked by consistent winds, consistent currents, consistent waves, and allowed for people, goods, and ideas to move. We think about the Mediterranean as connected in these small regions and connected from end to end. The end-to-end connections, the big-scale connections, the connections that were made possible by the Roman Empire are connections that are very different from what we're seeing here. Our commitment to thinking about these invisible connections extends into the present day. And some of the work that we've been thinking about more recently in our work in Southeast Sicily, with connections to our earlier work in Turkey, involves the movement of people, of displaced peoples, moving from the Turkish coast, in many cases from the areas right around Halicarnassus and the Bodrum Peninsula, moving across the Mediterranean, short distances to the Greek islands, where we've seen over the past 15 years increasing numbers of people displaced from Syria, from Palestine, but also from Africa, from Asia, making their way toward Europe. They go in small boats, probably quite similar, in some cases quite similar in size and scale to the boat at Pabuç. They also move in boats that are tiny little zodiacs designed only to make a short distance hop, and violating in many cases the common form of movement that we see. But we also see in Southeast Sicily boats that show evidence of small 14-meter boats designed for local movement, making their way on longer voyages across now to Southeast Sicily. So you're looking at 3 boats that were found that are found on land in Southeast Sicily. They made their way, in each case, from Turkey. The boat on the bottom is a fishing boat that began its life in Iskenderun in the southern coast of Turkey. On the top, you're looking at a boat from Izmir. One is a fishing boat, one is a sailing boat. They give us a sense both of the decline of fishing in the Mediterranean, the decline in fish stocks in the east, across the Mediterranean, particularly in the south and the east, that has made the job of being a fisherman less profitable than selling one's boat to human traffickers. And so different forms of movements are happening. We see sailboats usually normally rented for charter holidays, again being used for greater profit to move people. All of these boats were intercepted or abandoned on the on the Sicilian coast. We recorded them archaeologically in order to again bring visibility to the journeys and the peoples whose lives and whose experiences are too often overlooked in kind of these big pictures of pan-Mediterranean open movement or big numbers of how many thousands of migrants arrived in a particular month of a particular year. Here we're looking at the archaeological evidence for the people and the boats that too often are overlooked and whose stories are not told. So archaeology, the archaeological gaze, allows us to get some insight and enhance our humanity about these movements, both regular and violating all reality of regular because of the boundaries that have made movements impossible. And so I wanted to end there and here you're looking at on the Turkish end, this is not my research, but some research that's been done by Johannes Jungfleisch, who recorded departure sites on the coast of Turkey, what was left behind when people got onto boats, messages that were left for future displaced peoples who might end up on these same coasts, belongings that are left behind. By recording these modern contemporary boats alongside ancient boats, we can start thinking about both the connections and the disconnections that mark the Mediterranean from the present, from antiquity through the present day, and remind ourselves that our study is not just of objects and boats, but also of the people on them. So with that, I have many people and organizations that supported the project, and I thank all of them, and I thank all of you for your hospitality over these past 2 weeks. We're so grateful.
You can stay. So now we will dive into the queries and questions and comments and open the floor for the audience. So I will give for ladies first. Ladies first, please.
Yeah, so this one. Okay, yeah. Thank you for your talk. Fascinating. I was wondering, like, a ballpark figure, how many shipwrecks have actually been excavated from the archaic period? And also whether, like, the lack of data we have about these small embarkations that you present that were probably the majority, why we don't have any examples of that already, is that we just don't choose to excavate for them all? Like, imagine they've got, like, lots of images of shipwrecks, but they don't necessarily go for small ones to excavate, or like what's that dynamic in terms of that research bias?
Thanks. That's a great question. And the fact of the matter is, for the 6th century in the Eastern Mediterranean, you have seen 100, well, I take it back. Up until 5 years ago, you would have seen 100% of the evidence. There is now another shipwreck from the 6th century that is a quite different shipwreck. It probably began in Cyprus. It carried a cargo of terracotta statues on it, alongside a big cargo of these mortaria, or these big shallow bowls that we found 4 of. They have about 150, maybe 200 of them, along with a few amphors. But the kind of glamour of that site was, of course, the terracotta statues. So, yes, I can say the press releases about the statue wreck versus the amphora wreck were quite spectacularly different, as well as the news coverage. But the fact is, there simply aren't that many that have been found. Maybe because they are overwhelmingly smaller along the coast, and so they're this wreck, the Pabuç Burnu wreck, when it was found, literally visible on the surface were 8 jars and 1 pitcher, and it was only because we had been told this is an unusual jar, come look. I think it's early, and so we went to see and decided to commit some resources to a period about which a lot was not known. In the Western Mediterranean, there are more. Excavated, probably 5-ish, most of which have that same laced construction that we see at Pabuç Burnu, a couple of which all the way off the coast of Spain have more of the mortise and tenon construction that we see in what's thought to be a Phoenician style, and so the southern Mediterranean up to Spain kind of fits that. But the sample size is small, and Justin, who works on the Roman period, and I frequently debate the various merits and demerits of having data and being tied to your data, and having very little data and being able to say, I can suggest whatever model I want, and it is up to you to agree or disagree. And not everyone agrees with me. I've had lots of arguments about whether the mortaria are measuring devices or food preparation devices or other things. So yes, our sample size is impossibly small, but it's all we have for now.
Nice. So, Gustavo, please.
Thank you for the lecture. For the last 10 days, I've been worried about how we think about the pre-monetary economy. I think capitalism distorts our vision a little bit. We think about profit and things like that, when probably I think that these traders from the archaic period were probably trying just to get by, like the farmers were trying to get by. We talk about subsistence farming, but not about subsistence sea trade. I think we should revise that, because we are talking about barter, escambo in Portuguese, not trade in any other way. A sea trader from the spirit could not amass wealth. I can only imagine someone after a very, very successful trip coming home with like a gold ring or something like that. But that's not true profit in a modern sense. What do you think about that?
I think if we look at what survives in the literary record, and we see Theognis, you must search on the broad back sea to find a release from grievous poverty, or Hesiod, who talks about the farmer putting their goods to sea to get some extra what? Yes, I think you're right. There's no way that this level of exchange is resulting in the great amassing of wealth. We hear from Herodotus, for example, and later authors about the famous archaic sailors who made their way all the way to the west, all the way to Gibraltar, and came home with a new cargo of something that made them famous and made them very wealthy. But I'm sure that was the exception rather than the norm for your average people. State-driven, elite-driven trade was going to be on a different scale. What is Polycrates doing in Samos? What is Sappho's brother doing? Are these people moving more goods around, more exotic goods around? Probably so. The sculpture wreck of the same period is probably generating more profit and requires a greater investment. But a boat like this, which I think was the norm for local small-scale exchange, what you describe is absolutely the case. It's not organized, city-driven markers. Amphoras are not these state markers of standardized vessels. They're the pickup truck bringing goods to the farmer's market. So yes, thank you.
Anyone else? Yep. So I will read. Good afternoon. It's Mateus Gaudêncio. I lost the beginning, so this subject may have been already explained. But if not, which survey techniques you use to locate the shipwreck? Thanks.
Thank you. The ship was found in what is the most efficient way to find ancient shipwrecks. Somebody told us where it was. A local diver who runs a diving business and had been trained as an underwater archaeologist, so he knew all of the local archaeology, told us about the wreck, said these are unusual amphoras, come look and see what you think. So we were literally brought to the exact site of the wreck and told where it was. That is by far the most efficient way to find shipwrecks in the Mediterranean, and also a great way of staying involved with the local diving community. One of the reasons that the Institute of Nautical Archaeology has been so successful in kind of being aware of shipwrecks off the Turkish coast is because of that long relationship with the local museum, with the local community. People tell us where these wrecks are, and in most cases know who to come and tell. So it's been it's a helpful way, but lower technology than I suspect you were hoping for.
So, more questions? Please, Juliana. Please stand up because we are recording.
I'm thinking about the globalization over time. And I would like to know what's your opinion about the concepts like localization, for example, in your studies with shipwrecks? It's so interesting questions that bring us. I would like to know.
Thanks. I mean, obviously, when we talk about globalization, it's more Mediterraneanization in this period than global, but we are certainly seeing a bigger world. The degree to which the local then plays a role in that bigger world is always a question. To what degree do we see local communities becoming more internationalized from that opening up of the seas? We see amphoras similar to the Pabuç Burnu amphoras, probably coming from Samos or Miletus, that make their way to Sicily, to Italy, and they're found on shipwrecks. So there is bigger movement, but I think we have to think about not just the expansion, but the persistence of the local. And so even as it might have been more possible to acquire more goods from abroad, we probably don't yet have that fully integrated Mediterraneanization that's visible at every level. At Pabuç Burnu, there's nothing, or there's almost nothing that comes from anything other than this really local sphere. And I think that the persistence of the local habit maintains even as we get to a more integrated world.
Okay.
I do have one comment for you, Marcia.
Oh, go ahead.
We have no lamps.
That's a shame.
We have no lamps.
That's
And it's
completely
something
shame.
that I was very conscious of when we were excavating. because lamps are extremely common on shipwrecks, both as cargo, as you guys have seen, and also used at night. And so one of the, if you will believe in the absence of evidence for argument, I can say that part of our ship is not going on long voyages far away is that they had no capacity
To do it.
to have a lamp to see at night.
Yeah.
They're day sailors. They went on these short local journeys, many of which from for example, Bodrum to Knidos, Halicarnassus to Knidos is a few hours sail.
People are probably doing during the day.
Mm-hmm.
And also lamps are personal objects.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's
So
That's
I meant to incorporate that in the talk just for you,
Thank
but
you so much.
forgot.
More questions in the internet? No? So good. So we are very delighted with this talk. It was wonderful, many insights. I believe this idea of highlight other networks that is more local, that's the invisible networks that usually we don't pay attention. It's a wonderful, wonderful idea and research. Thank you so much, Professor Liz, and okay, that's it, people.